A few weeks ago, the arguer made a claim stating that the universities adopting acceptable speech policy are leading the way to censorship of freedom of speech. He made two secondary claims. The first one stating that policies are often written in a way that is vague and uncertain, so they cover up a very broad basis. And that second one, the policy creates an environment that discourages the discussion of conflicting ideas. And my response to this claim is that the evidence this arguer used were neither efficient nor relevant to his actual claim. And before I start going into a secondary claim, just point out, in his main claim, the cause is pointed at the universities, saying that because they're adopting policies, they cause the censorship of freedom of speech. However, in all of his secondary claims, the cause is pointed to the policies, saying that they are the one at fault, leading to censorship rather than university. And that's a problem because I went into the organization that he was referring to called the Foundation of Individual Right in Education, and it actually states that in 2003, the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights wrote an open letter to all university presidents affirming that the federal harassment regulations are not intended to restrict the exercise of any expressive activities protected under the United States Constitution. Nevertheless, many universities maintain harassment policy that do violate on their student and faculty members' freedom of speech rights. In other words, it's not the policies at fault, it's the universities. Going into the secondary claims, he stated that policies are often written in a way that is vague and uncertain, so they cover up a very broad basis. This claim was based on examples of professors accused of sexual or racial harassment and then thus being punished. First of all, this had no clear connection to the actual claim, particularly the policy, rather than stating the actual policies these universities undergo by giving the examples of professors being punished and the effects of them, but it doesn't really tell you what is the purpose, like what's the purpose of stating that example. But reading into his outline, according to his outline, it says that he was attempting to achieve the rational leap that these policy allows punishment for protected speech. But again, it wasn't clear. I only knew this because I read his outline. But when I was listening to his speech, I didn't know why. But even if he did make the point clear and that policy allowed punishment for protected speech, I do have a counterclaim to that, which is, according to the same organization who stated, that they actually say every university must have a policy prohibiting sexual harassment or any other forms of discrimination, harassment, and that harassment is not protected by the First Amendment. And for speech to be considered harassment, however, it must meet a very specific definition. In the educational context, harassment must be conducted so severe and objectively offensive and undermines and distracts the victim's educational experience. Put simply, to be legally punished for discrimination in harassment, one must be far more than simply being rude or offensive. They must be actively engaged in this activity for it to be punished, like defined by the law. So this claim was not sufficient in my point of view, nor was it relevant to his claim. And second, in his secondary claim, he states that the policy creates an environment that discourages the discussion of conflicting ideas. This claim was only backed up by one evidence, and it was a quote by from the website The Atlantic, stating that basically how the policy is creating an environment where everyone must think twice before speaking up, least facing charges of insensitivity, aggression, or worse. It was a very informative and helpful quote. However, the arguer fails to give credibility to this quote. He didn't mention where was it from, who was the author of this, but I looked into it, and they were from people that has great credibility. One was a constitutional lawyer, and the other was a psychologist who studies the American cultural wars. And understand that why am I giving him credit is because, again, this claim was not relevant to his main point. By stating that an environment that discourages the discussion of conflicting ideas, to me it points more to how maybe it deprives the university of what its purpose is rather than pointing that, oh, it censors freedom of speech. And I can back this up by saying that the University of Michigan Extension actually articulated 8 crucial elements essential to a healthy development of young people in educational places. And it literally states, youth have a safe place to talk with other youth and adults about values and topics that are important to them is a crucial key to a quality of youth development in education. So in other words, by this points more to how a university should be rather than how this like takes out the freedom of speech, right? Yeah. So in conclusion, the evidence this arguer used are neither relevant nor efficient to his claim, stating that universities adopting acceptable speech policies are leading the way to censorship or freedom of speech. However, it was helpful information that maybe would prove otherwise to claims such as universities being robbed of its purpose due to the policy they undergo. But again, it wasn't relevant to his claim. That's all.
Well, you labeled the advocate's points pretty clearly. You're challenging the application of it, and I think that there's a lot of confusion at the beginning. At one point you say, well, it's the policies, it's not the university, and then later on you say it's the university, not the policies, and I'm not sure why either of those mitigates the argument that the advocate is saying, and that is that these kinds of things are limiting freedom of speech in especially college campuses. So there doesn't seem to be any denial that there are situations where people's speech rights have been limited in some degree. There's a little bit of an argument that says that they shouldn't be under the DOE policies, that the harassment has to exist in a particular context. I think that that's your best line of argument, and that is that the application of the harassment policies that the DOE requires is a mistake that somebody is making, but it is not a mistake of the Department of Education policies. But the fact that it's the mistake of university policies, I'm not sure that that mitigates the argument as much as saying people are misunderstanding this, and if anybody fought against it, it would be probably dismissed if there were court rulings on these sorts of issues. The problem might be the way that it's administratively handled as opposed to done through a court system. I'm not sure. That probably is part of the advocate's original argument. On the question of uncertainty and it being vague, I think we're back to the same issue. There's not really discussion of what the examples are that the advocate presented. There's kind of a generic set of discussions of examples that you have. Your counterclaim basically says, the same sort of thing. We're back to this dispute about what constitutes harassment. I thought that you had a good piece of information here that talked about how it has to be specific, it has to be intentional. There were like several other things that were going on this, and then you don't really tell us what the source is on that. That seems to me like the best piece of information you have in the argument, that for something to constitute the kind of harassment that could be punished, it has to fall into very specific categories. And I think that that does respond effectively to the argument that the advocate presented. On the last point, again, you kind of dismiss it as not being relevant. I'm not exactly sure that it's not relevant if we interpret the policies and procedures and the university as all being the same thing, and we're simply saying, let's say the proposition was phrased a little bit differently, and that is that the way harassment issues or the way speech codes are being applied is limiting free speech on campuses, then it's not a question of whether it's the DOE, whether it's the universities, whether it's something else that's going on there. It's just we're saying this is having a particular effect. Where's the information that kind of contradicts that? That's, I think, is something that's missing in the argument. I thought it was well organized. I thought you had some interesting analysis on a couple of points and that you needed to cite your evidence more, especially on that second point. All right, thank you.